All right. Welcome to another deep dive
Yeah.
where we take a really fascinating topic, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And we try to find like the best sources
Yeah, for sure.
that are out there, and
The most interesting ones, definitely.
we'll kind of give you the core insights from that.
Yeah, that's the goal, right? Like a shortcut to getting really well informed.
Right, exactly. Yeah, think of this as like your little cheat sheet to really
Exactly.
understanding something complex, you know?
Well, you're here because you want to get the gist of it
That's right.
without like getting bogged down in all the details, right?
Right.
And you get like those moments where
Yes,
it all kind of clicks into place.
absolutely. Yeah, and today,
Today's going to be a good one.
I think so, yeah.
We're going deep into the world of a really sharp mind from medieval philosophy,
Right.
Walter Chatton.
Walter Chatton.
Yeah.
Now, I'm just going to put it out there. He may not be as immediately recognizable
Not a household name.
as some of his contemporaries.
Like, say, Aquinas or...
Right, exactly, yeah.
Right.
But you know, he was a major player
Oh,
in
absolutely.
14th century intellectual life.
He was a real force.
Yeah.
And, you know, not only was he a contemporary of William of Ockham,
Right.
but he was also a really pointed critic of Ockham.
Right, okay.
Yeah, and yet at the same time,
Yeah.
he also explored some really fascinating metaphysical questions, maybe even more speculatively than Occam.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh, so you're saying that even though he was a critic of Occam,
Right.
he was perhaps like more into metaphysics.
More willing to go out on a limb, metaphysically.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
And he also defended, by the way,
Yeah.
certain arguments made by John Duns Scotus, you know?
SCOTUS, okay.
Yeah, so he's got this interesting...
Yeah, so there's a lot going on here.
Yeah, he's got his own distinct profile.
It's not just an Occam reaction.
Exactly.
Wow.
And he also championed the idea that how we understand things really depends on our perspective, our point of view.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and what makes him even more interesting
Right.
is that he wasn't just some ivory tower scholar.
Right, okay.
He was very successful in the church hierarchy.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah, he actually advised not one but two popes.
Wow.
Yeah, and was eventually appointed a bishop.
No kidding.
Yeah.
What happened there?
Sadly, he died before he could take office.
Oh, wow.
But, you know, his influence was still felt.
Right.
And, you know, his theological views even echoed centuries later at the Council of Trent.
Really? Wow, okay.
Yeah, so he had a lasting impact.
So it's not just that he was this,
Right.
you know, really interesting character,
Exactly.
but he had real, like, impact on
real influence.
on institutions and...
That's right.
Okay.
And while Occam specialists have kind of always known about Chatton,
Right.
it's really only recently with the publication of complete critical editions of his writings that people have been able to really appreciate his contributions more broadly.
I see. So what you're saying is that, like, in terms of the history of philosophy,
Right.
it's taken us a while to really appreciate him because the scholarship just wasn't there yet.
Yeah, we didn't have all the material.
Right.
And so our deep dive today, we're not going to try to cover everything.
Right.
That's impossible.
Yeah, this guy sounds pretty complicated.
Yeah, but we're going to focus on some specific philosophical challenges that he tackled.
Okay.
And what's amazing is that these challenges are still debated by philosophers today.
Wow. All right. So let's jump in here.
Let's do it.
So first of all, to really get a sense of Chatton, we need
Right.
a little bit of a sketch of
Little background.
his world. Yeah.
Yeah, so picture 14th century Europe.
Oh.
Theology is the name of the game, right?
Right.
It's the big overarching framework.
Right. The context for everything.
Exactly. But within that framework, there's this surprising diversity of philosophical viewpoints.
Okay. So it's not.
It's not a monolithic thing.
Right.
You've got your realists, your nominalists.
Yeah.
Even some skeptical voices popping up.
Really? Even back then?
Oh, yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, and these thinkers mainly engaged with each other through these detailed commentaries on established authorities.
Okay.
So, you know, forget the modern idea of just coming up with your own new theory.
Right.
The real skill was in how you interpreted Aristotle or Augustine,
Right.
and how you argued with your contemporaries about those interpretations.
Yeah. Okay. So they're having these big debates.
Oh, yeah, huge public debates with
Okay.
hundreds of people attending.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, so the universities of Paris and Oxford,
Right.
these were Chatton's intellectual battlegrounds.
Right.
He wrestled with Aristotle and Augustine, of course,
Right.
but also with Aquinas, Scotus, Occam, Campbell, Wadamim, Oriel.
Okay. Yeah. So a lot of the names.
A lot of names, yeah.
Yeah. That we've covered on previous episodes. So
Yeah, exactly.
that's cool.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating is the relationship between Chatton and Occam.
Okay.
Their ideas are so intertwined that to really grasp one,
Yeah.
you almost need to understand the other.
Okay.
And a perfect example of this is Chatton's famous anti-razor,
Okay.
which was a direct response to Occam's principle of parsimony.
Okay. So let's talk about this anti-razor,
Okay, sure.
or as they call the Chatton principle.
Right.
So to get this, I think we need to talk a little bit about this
Yeah.
kind of long-standing philosophical tension between the realists and the nominalists.
Absolutely, that's key.
So tell me a little bit about that.
Right, so at the core of this debate is the question of what's really real.
Okay.
Right, so realists tend to see this deep, often unseen
Yeah.
metaphysical structure to reality.
Okay.
So things like, numbers,
Right.
properties, causal connections,
Right.
they think these things exist independently of our minds. Nominalists, on the other hand,
Yeah.
are a lot more cautious.
Okay.
They think that's just multiplying entities unnecessarily.
Right.
Like, why do we need all that extra stuff?
Right. Okay.
Yeah, so it's not just about what exists.
Right.
It's also about how we should argue for what exists.
Okay.
So what counts as a good reason to believe in something?
Right. So the rules of the game.
Exactly, the rules of the game.
Okay.
And that's where the philosophy of language comes in.
Right.
Because realists might say,
Yeah.
look, certain statements just can't be true unless certain kinds of entities exist.
Okay. So the way we talk
Yeah,
gives us a clue as to what's really there.
exactly.
Okay.
So this link between our language
Mhm.
and what we're committed to believing exists.
Right.
Philosophers call that ontological commitment.
Ontological commitment.
Yeah, big word.
Okay. And so Occam,
Right.
who was, very much on the nominalist side,
Definitely anomalous.
he used this idea of parsimony, right?
He was a master of parsimony.
Like we shouldn't multiply entities beyond necessity.
Exactly. Don't multiply entities without absolute necessity.
Right. Okay.
And that's his famous razor, right?
Yeah. Right. Occam's razor.
Occam's razor.
Okay. So Chatton
Yeah.
thought Occam's razor was a little...
He thought it was too simplistic, especially when you're dealing with certain kinds of relations.
Okay. Interesting. So
Right.
he's not against the general principle.
No, not at all.
Oh.
But he thinks Occam was a little too quick to use it.
Okay.
Yeah. So Occam's basic idea was we shouldn't assume distinctions between things outside of our minds
Okay.
unless we have really clear proof,
Okay.
either from self-evident truths, undeniable experience, or infallible authority.
Okay. Yeah.
And Chatton felt like that was too restrictive, especially when you're talking about things like relations.
Okay. So he's saying that.
He thinks that in some cases,
Yeah.
what he calls semantic arguments,
Yeah.
so arguments based on the meaning of our language, can actually establish the existence of real relations.
Interesting. Okay. So he thinks that we can actually learn things about reality
Exactly.
by looking at how our language works.
That's right.
Oh.
Yeah, and that's how he came up with his counter principle,
Right.
which he called various things like my proposition, a method of responding, my rule.
Right.
We now know it as the Chatton principle.
The Chan principle.
Yeah, and it's a direct challenge to Occam's razor.
Okay. So what's the principle?
Right, so in its early formulation,
Yeah.
he basically says that if a true statement requires the existence of more things to be true,
Right.
then we're justified in saying those things exist.
Right. I mean, that sounds...
It sounds obvious.
Yeah, like, obviously, like, if it has to be there for this to be true,
Right.
then it's there.
Right.
Yeah.
But it has some interesting implications.
Okay.
Yeah, so he later kind of refined this into a more detailed version,
Okay.
where he says if two existing things, no matter how they're arranged or how long they've existed,
Okay.
cannot make a particular statement true,
Right.
and you need something else to make it true,
Yeah.
then that something else must exist.
Okay. So it's a little more...
A little more nuanced.
Yeah. It's not just simply if it's needed,
Right.
but it's like...
It's like, okay, you've got these two things. You can arrange them however you want.
Right.
You can let them exist for as long as you want.
Right.
But if they still can't make this statement true,
Yeah.
then you need something else.
You're missing something.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, and this principle, it actually has two key stages.
Okay.
The first stage is the idea that our language can guide us to what exists in reality.
Okay.
So if a statement is true,
Right.
we can analyze it and see what kinds of things are necessary to make it true.
Okay.
And philosophers call these things truth makers.
Truth makers. Okay.
Yeah. So the things that make our statements true,
Right.
and for Chatton, these truth makers,
Yeah.
they're always real entities, real things.
Okay.
Yeah.
But how do we know?
Right.
if we've found enough of these truth makers?
That's a good question. That's where the second stage of his principle comes in.
Okay.
So he gives us a test for what's insufficient.
Okay.
He says that a particular set of entities isn't enough to make a true sentence true.
Right.
If we can consistently imagine a scenario where those entities exist, but the statement is false.
Okay.
So it's kind of an a priori thought experiment.
Right, like a thought experiment.
Yeah, we're imagining, okay, within the realm of what God could possibly do,
Right.
if these existing entities
Yeah.
and their causal powers
Right.
are enough to make this statement true.
Okay, yeah. So like if I have all the ingredients for a cake,
Exactly.
but I still don't have a cake,
Right.
I must be missing something.
You're missing an ingredient. Yeah.
Right. Okay, I get it.
Yeah. So you keep adding entities to your picture of reality
Right.
until you can't imagine a scenario where that statement is false anymore.
Right. Okay.
And underlying this whole approach is Chatton's reliance on what's called the principle of contradictories,
Okay.
which basically says you can't go from a state of contradiction
Right.
to another contradictory state
Right.
without some real thing either coming into existence or ceasing to exist.
Okay, so it's about like things changing.
Right, tracking changes in truth values
Yeah.
and linking them to changes in reality.
Okay, but this is where
Right.
Occam raises his objections.
This is where the fireworks start.
Okay, so what was Occam's problem with this?
So Occam thought that Chatton's principle
Yeah.
was way too quick to add new entities to the world.
Okay.
Right, he thought Chatton was being too extravagant.
Okay.
So Occam actually broadens the principle of contradictories.
Okay.
And he says that changes in truth value
Yeah.
can also be explained by things like movement
Right.
or the passage of time,
Right.
not just the creation or destruction of fundamental entities.
Right. So like if I say, oh, this podium is to my left,
Right.
and then I walk around it,
Exactly.
then it's now on my right.
Right.
And the truth value of the sentence has changed.
Exactly.
But I haven't created or destroyed any entities.
It's just moved. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
So Occam's saying you don't need to posit a new entity every time the truth value of a sentence changes.
Right. Okay.
And this directly challenges Chatton's idea
right.
that if a statement's truth value changes,
Yeah.
it's got to be because something in reality has changed.
Right. Okay. And so Chatton
Yeah.
tries to counter this, right?
He does. He tries to counter this
So how does he do that?
by adding this arrangement and duration clause to his principle.
Okay.
So he's basically trying to hold time and movement constant
Right.
to force the conclusion that you do need a new entity.
Right. So he's saying
Right, he's saying even if you
factor in the movement,
even if you factor in the movement and the time,
you still need this other thing.
you still need something else. But ultimately, to really hold his ground against Occam,
Right.
Chatton had to go further
Okay.
and actually challenge Occam's theory of connotation.
Okay. And that's a whole other.
That's a whole other can of worms.
Yeah, we won't get into that right now.
We'll save that for another deep dive.
All right. But it really shows you
Right.
how much they were.
It was a real intellectual battle.
Yeah. Going back and forth on this.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's shift gears a little bit here.
Okay, sure.
Let's talk about categories and universals.
All right, that's a fun one.
So medieval philosophers, they inherited
All right.
Aristotle's 10 categories,
That's right.
right? Which are,
Substance, quantity, quality, relation,
right.
time, place, action, passion, position, and state.
Okay, so 10 of them.
10 basic categories.
Right, and there was a debate about
A big debate.
whether these were categories of our concepts, of
Yeah.
our words.
Or of actual things in the world.
Right, okay.
Yeah, so where do they fit in?
Right, okay. And Chatton tries to find a middle ground here.
He does. He kind of positions himself between Scotus and Occam.
Right, so tell me a little bit about that.
So Scotus thought these categories primarily reflected real, mind-independent essences,
Okay.
and only secondarily our language.
Right.
Occam, on the other hand, saw them as purely semantic.
Right, so Occam thinks it's about how we talk.
Yeah, it's about the terms we use.
Right, okay, and Chatton.
Chatton's interesting.
Yeah.
He's kind of in between.
Okay.
So he agrees with Scotus that there are these 10 fundamental classes of things in reality.
Okay.
But he agrees with Occam that the categories themselves
Yeah.
are 10 different kinds of terms that map onto those classes.
Okay, so he thinks,
So he thinks there are these real things out there.
Right.
And we use these categories to talk about them.
okay, and that's what the categories are. They're these terms.
Exactly. They're these terms that we use to carve up reality.
Okay, and what I think is cool about Chatton is that he uses
Yeah.
the Chatton principle
His own principle?
to actually argue for the existence
That's right.
of these classes?
Yeah, these ontological classes.
Okay, so he's not just saying, like,
Right.
we need to have these categories.
Right.
He's saying...
He's saying these categories reflect something real.
Okay, so
Yeah.
he calls these
He calls them semantic categories.
semantic categories.
Yes, so...
And he thinks they're like this framework.
Exactly, a framework of predicables.
Okay.
So things that can be predicated or said about other things.
Right, okay.
And we use these predicables to form really precise definitions of things.
Okay.
And we might think of these things as natural kinds.
Natural kinds.
Now, the essence of what it means to be a human being.
Right, okay.
Or a dog.
Right, okay.
And these categories, they range from these broad concepts, like substance,
Okay.
down to more specific concepts like human being, with lots of levels in between.
Right, okay.
And above them are what he called transcendental concepts, like being, which are even more general.
Okay, so it's like a hierarchy.
It's a hierarchy, exactly, from the most general to the most specific.
Right.
And below them are individual concepts, like Socrates.
Right, okay, so Socrates is a more specific concept than human being.
Exactly.
Okay.
So he's got this whole hierarchy of concepts, and he thinks that these category concepts are really important for constructing definitions, especially what he called real definitions.
Okay, so what's a real definition?
So a real definition picks out the essence of a thing.
Okay.
So, for example, rational animal would be the real definition of human being.
Okay, and that tells us?
That tells us what it really means to be a human being.
Okay.
Yeah, and in that definition, rational is what he called the essential difference.
Okay.
So that's what sets humans apart from other animals.
Right, okay, so that's what makes us different.
Exactly, it's the thing that makes us unique.
Okay.
Yeah, and Chatton thought that there were two key features of these category concepts.
Okay.
One is that they're essential.
Okay.
Meaning they're necessary parts of what something is.
Right, so like...
So like you can't be a human being without being rational.
Right, okay, so rationality is part of what it means to be human.
Exactly, that's essential to being human.
Okay.
And the second feature is that they're universal.
Okay.
Meaning they apply to every instance of that thing.
Right. So every human being is rational.
Every human being is rational.
Okay.
All right. So Chatton's view of categories is that they're these terms we use to carve up reality. They're these terms that have these two features.
Yeah, essential and universal.
Right. And they help us to construct these.
They help us to construct real definitions.
Right. Okay.
And they're based on these real ontological classes.
Right. Okay.
Now, Chatton also talks about how individual things fit into these categories.
Right. Yeah, so he says that an individual thing belongs to a particular category if the species concept that signifies it can be essentially predicated by all the genus concepts in its categorical line.
Okay, that's a mouthful.
It is, but it's basically saying that there's this hierarchical structure of predication that reflects a hierarchy of being.
Right. Okay, give me an example.
Sure. So Socrates.
Yeah.
He's in the category of substance.
Right.
Because substance, body, organism, and animal can all be essentially predicated of human being. Right. Which in turn can be predicated of Socrates.
Okay, so it's like you're going up this chain.
You're going up this chain of categories, and you're saying Socrates is he's an individual.
Right.
Who falls under all these different categories.
Right, because he's a human being, and human beings are animals.
Exactly.
And animals are organisms.
Yeah.
And organisms are bodies, and bodies are substances.
And all of those are substances. That's right. So it's a neat way of connecting the individual to these broader categories.
Okay, so now that we've got a sense of what Chatton thinks categories are, let's talk a little bit about why he thinks there are these 10 specific categories.
So Chatton actually rejects the explanation given by Oriel and Occam, who said that these categories just come from asking 10 different questions about a substance.
Okay, so like
what is it? How big is it?
What kind is it? Where?
Exactly.
Okay.
But Chatton raises some objections to this.
Okay, so what are his objections?
Well, first of all, why limit ourselves to just 10 questions?
Right. Why not 11?
Why not 11? Why not 20?
Okay.
Secondly, why only ask about substance?
Right.
Why not ask these questions about the other category?
Right. Yeah.
And third, he points out that if that were the case, God, who's obviously a substance, would fall into most, if not all, of the categories.
Right. Okay.
So Chatton's not buying that explanation.
Right.
He offers his own alternative.
Okay.
He says that we have these 10 categories because there are 10 fundamental classes of real things that we need to define in a very specific and structured way.
Okay, so the categories are there to...
Yeah, they're there to map onto these ontological classes.
Okay, and he uses...
And he uses his principle, of course.
Right, the Chatton principle to argue for these.
That's right.
Okay, so give me an example of how he does that.
Sure. So he had already done this for relations in his earlier work, where he argued that we need to posit real relational entities to make propositions like heat causes heat true.
Right, because there's got to be.
Yeah, there's got to be a real relation there.
Between the heat and the heat.
Exactly. Okay. And in his later work, the Lectura, he expands on this, and he argues for the existence of substances, qualities, and quantities.
Right, all based on his principle.
All based on the Chatton principle.
Right.
And he gives a really interesting example from the doctrine of the Eucharist.
Okay, yes.
So, in the Eucharist, the bread and wine are consecrated, and they become the body and blood of Christ.
Right, okay.
And Chatton argues that it's impossible for the quantities of two distinct hosts to exist in the exact same spatial arrangement at the same time.
Okay, yeah, so you can't have two...
You can't have two things occupying the same space at the same time.
Right.
And he says that neither the substances nor the qualities can explain this incompatibility.
Okay.
So we have to posit the existence of quantities as a distinct category of being.
So quantities are real things.
Quantities are real things, according to Chatton.
Okay, and what's interesting is he says that quantity is associated with this idea of impenetrability.
That's right.
So the fact that two things can't occupy the same space at the same time.
Exactly. It's not just about extension.
Right.
It's about this more fundamental inability to be in the same place.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. And this leads us nicely to another big debate in medieval philosophy, the debate on universals.
Universals, okay.
Yeah, so these are things that seem to be predicable of many things.
Okay.
So like humanity.
Right.
Which applies to all human beings.
Right, okay.
And the big question was, is there really a shared property?
Right, like humanity.
Yeah, that all human beings possess.
Okay.
Or is it just the case that individual particular things exist?
Right, so that's the nominalist position.
Yeah, it's the nominalist position.
That there is no humanity.
Yeah, just individual humans.
Right, and so Chatton gets into this debate.
He does. He jumps right in. Host